Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. If you really care about environmental justice, you should care about reproductive justice, hosted by the National Women's Law Center and If, When, How. My name is Yumhee Park, and I'm the Engagement and Mobilization Manager at the National Women's Law Center. We have a few technical notes before we begin the presentations. First, all lines will be on mute during today's webinar. Second, we will be taking questions after our experts are finished with the presentation, but we encourage you all to submit questions throughout the webinar. You can submit a question by typing it using the chat function. Finally, we will be recording this webinar, and you'll receive a link to the recording of the presentation as well as a link to the slides within the next few days. And at this point, I'd like to turn the floor over to Kelly Garcia, our Director of Reproductive Justice Initiatives and Senior Counsel at the National Women's Law Center.
Great, thank you, Yumhee. We are really excited to have everyone joining our third and final presentation. I just want to make sure that people can see my slides.
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is our third and final webinar of this year's If You Really Care About series. Sorry, I am having a hard time advancing. So we are thrilled to be wrapping up another year of our partnership with If, When, How on the If You Really Care About series. Today, though, before we get started with today's presentations, I want to pass the conversation off to Mariko Miki at If, When, How.
Thanks, Kelly. Hi, everyone. My name is Mariko Miki, and I'm the Director of Academic and Professional Programs at the National Office of If, When, How, Lawyering for Reproductive Justice. So as Kelly mentioned, this is the third and final webinar of If, When, How and National Women's Law Center's 8th annual series. And we are excited to have had the opportunity to work together again. And we're so glad that you've joined us today and throughout this series. In case this is the first time you are tuning into this webinar series, or if you may not be familiar with If, When, How, we are a national nonprofit that trains, networks, and mobilizes law students and legal professionals to work within and beyond the legal system to champion reproductive justice. We work with chapters on law school campuses across the country, our incredible reproductive justice federal fellows in Washington, D.C., state fellows in Seattle and Pittsburgh, and HIV fellows in Atlanta and Oakland, and a robust community of alumni and legal professionals. If, When, How believes that achieving reproductive justice will take thoughtful action and strategic activism, acknowledging the intersection of identities, collaborating across disciplines, and working toward a critical transformation of the current legal system. Because ensuring that all people have the right to decide if, when, and how to create families depends entirely on if, when, and how hard we fight. So on behalf of If, When, How, I want to give a big thank you today to the National Women's Law Center, particularly Kelly, Yumhee, and Mikkel, as well as our esteemed presenters for bringing their expertise to this webinar. Thank you for your interest in reproductive justice, and I'll turn it back to Kelly.
Great, thank you, Mariko. We are very excited to be wrapping up again. This is our 8th annual presentation of these webinars. And before I get started, I want to tell you a little bit about the National Women's Law Center and really briefly about the goal of this webinar series. So the center has worked for more than 40 years to protect and promote equality and opportunity for women and families. We champion policies and laws that help women and girls achieve their potential at every stage of their lives, at school, at work, at home, and in retirement. Our staff are committed advocates who take on the toughest challenges, especially for the most vulnerable women. So the goal of the series that we have put together and sponsored with If, When, How has really been to elucidate the link between reproductive justice and other progressive issues. And we really, when we dreamed up, or my predecessors dreamed up what this webinar would be, it was really, the idea behind it was to introduce people who are working on social justice issues that aren't reproductive justice to the idea and the concepts of reproductive justice, and to introduce reproductive justice advocates to the to other social justice movements, and to really look for the ways in which they overlap. And so before we get started with the meat of our presentation, do you want to talk quickly, for those of you who are joining this webinar for the first time or unfamiliar with the reproductive justice movement, that reproductive justice really focuses on the right of individuals to have the children they want, raise the children they have, and plan their families through safe legal access to abortion and contraception. Reproductive justice requires that all people have the resources, as well as the economic, social, and political power to make decisions about their bodies, sexuality, and reproduction with self-determination and dignity. And so the reproductive justice movement was really a response to the fact that women of color, low-income women, and younger women are as likely, if not more likely, to face resistance to their childbearing and child-rearing as they are to have trouble accessing contraception and abortion. And they are also more likely to live in areas, as we're going to talk about today, that face problems like environmental pollution, and to have experienced systemic racism that affects their ability to raise and care for the children they have in safe and healthy environments. So we're going to talk today a lot about that overlap. So people's ability to exercise self-determination, including with their own reproductive lives, is necessarily affected by power inequalities within our society, institutions, and economic lives. And so reproductive justice explicitly calls on the government to play an affirmative role in making rights a reality, as well as remedying social inequality. I mean, this recognizes that social, political, and economic power are necessary to chart one's own future. And so reproductive justice is really part of a larger social justice movement, and recognizes that as long as there is social injustice, there will be reproductive oppression. And a particular interest when you're thinking about what the reproductive justice frame and lens and intersectional lens brings to and requires of us is very clear when we start talking and thinking about environmental justice, and that is that when you look, we need and must rely on a government that is functioning and working for the people and protecting people as a way to protect the environment and to help and protect reproductive justice. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker of the day, Tiana with Sierra Club.
Great, thank you. And thanks again for the invitation to speak with all of you on this topic. As a Sierra Club member and staff member, I've had the privilege of working at the intersection of women's rights and the environment in many ways throughout my career, and really excited to be bringing this work to the Sierra Club in partnership with some of the other groups on this conversation. So for those who don't know, the Sierra Club is a national environmental organization, 125 years old. We have over 3 million members in all 50 states and Puerto Rico. And we do outings in the outdoors, but we also do advocacy. And next slide, which typically you would imagine would be around environmental protection. So I often get the question of why gender? So the Sierra Club in 2015 adopted a strategic plan that spoke to some of the values listed in a Green 2.0 report by Gil Swanson that took a look at representation of people of color and marginalized identities, women in the environmental movement, and found, somewhat unsurprisingly, that those marginalized communities were underrepresented in the leadership of environmental advocacy. So with a commitment to enlisting the whole population in our journey and being inclusive of the realities and impacts of environmental challenges on all people, there has been an effort in recent years to really move towards equity and inclusion. That includes internal staff dedicated to that work, and then also programs like this that show up in partnership with our allies in the reproductive justice movement and thinking about intersectionality in the work on a day-to-day. So next slide. That said, there has been an environmental justice program at the Sierra Club for a long time, led by my colleague Leslie Fields, who is extraordinary. And this image here is of a short documentary of the Lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans, where the Sierra Club worked hand in hand with the community for 8 years following Katrina, really at the invitation of the community in terms of recovery, and really relying on the community's voices to be determining what resources the Sierra Club could lend and support otherwise. Next slide. So, the topic at hand this evening: reproductive justice, environmental justice, and human rights. So for many working in activism or advocacy, we know that we don't live our lives in silos. That said, reproductive rights and environmental movements really had watershed moments in the 1960s and 70s with Rachel Carson and Roe v. Wade. That was predominantly white-led and led to some silos in the advocacy as it was structured. I've heard examples of a Black woman activist in the 1970s working across those silos in New York City, but needing to go uptown for her civil rights work and downtown for her feminist work. In the 1980s, there was a growth of fights for justice against environmental racism, citing landfills near low-income communities and predominantly communities of color, Superfund site cleanup, and other toxic exposure in poorer neighborhoods. And while not all those fights were won, they created space for an important recognition among larger establishment groups, like the Sierra Club, to recognize and work with those communities most impacted. So it was a way of working differently than had been previously, and has created stronger outcomes and more authentic relationships, but it's definitely still a work in progress. And so in terms of environmental justice, the EPA formed an office for environmental justice in 1992 under an executive order by Bill Clinton. And at the same time, it was in the 90s is when the reproductive justice movement really came to be, coming out of a reproductive health convening from the UN in Cairo, building the framework for reproductive justice. So I put human rights there, which is largely the framework that remains prevalent in the global conversations around these topics. So UN negotiations and advocacy also often rely on human rights as the critical framework to advance these issues. So next slide, please. So this is a source of inspiration in putting together these slides. I took the time to watch these videos again and created hope. This is Senator Kamala Harris at the Women's March in Washington, D.C., the day after the inauguration, and she said in her remarks loud and clear, "You want to talk about women's rights? That's fantastic. Let's talk about healthcare, the economy, education, and climate change." She was one of the few speakers that day that really talked about the environment, and so excited to be seeing these conversations happening more often that really include environmental impacts on women's lives. Next slide. So what does that look like at the Sierra Club? It shows up in two ways. One is partnerships. Over the course of the past year, we have stood shoulder to shoulder with Planned Parenthood and health communities in protection of the access to birth control or the Affordable Care Act. The photo in the bottom right corner is a youth fellowship program that trains youth in Washington, D.C. twice a year on the intersection of these topics. And so I invite folks who are interested to follow up with more information about that. Our next training will take place in May. Next slide. But also, this is a lot of different issues to be intersecting all at once. It's a complex story, and we're committed to telling that story. Zika is a perfect example of really seeing the impact of environmental challenges directly impacting low-income communities. On the bottom right-hand corner is a research project put forward by the Population Institute that took a look at how areas where Zika was most prevalent were also areas that had the least access to reproductive health care in the United States, predominantly in the South. And then the other photo is an example of some of the activism the Sierra Club does to mobilize our membership through online action to make our voices heard in Congress in telling these stories and raising their profile. Next slide. So again, what does that look like? We have had action takers online on a variety of topics. We have a youth fellowship program and really getting out to tell these stories at various conferences, and again, in partnership with organizations like the National Women's Law Center, Women for Climate Justice, LGBTQ Task Force, and many others. Next slide. So why reproductive and environmental justice? To put it plainly, no matter one's gender, we all deserve access to clean air and clean water and a healthy and safe environment. As Kelly mentioned earlier, one of the pillars of reproductive justice is access to raise our children in a safe and healthy environment. And that, unfortunately, is not the reality for all women, including, and in particular, women of color who are disproportionately impacted. And so in working with all of you, we can act collectively to defend our rights and get toxics out of our environment. Next slide. To dig a little deeper on some examples of what toxics are impacting women's bodies and those of our children, we'll take a look at oil and gas extractive industry, pesticides and water pollution, personal care products, and then briefly discuss the beauty salons, farm workers, and cleaning products. On the left is a toolkit that I encourage you all to take a look at. It has a lot of these resources that we're discussing this evening available for you online. Next slide. So what does coal have to do with reproductive health? Coal ash is the waste product left over after coal is burned. And while the chemicals and toxic contents vary widely, there is predominantly mercury, cadmium, chromium, and lead, arsenic. Some of the deadliest toxics are found in coal ash, which is particularly dangerous for pregnant women and young children as they can damage the developing brain and nervous system. On the left is a photo from a campaign led by our Beyond Coal campaign, which has helped close down over 200 coal-fired power plants in the last 8 years. And when you think about impacts, environmental impacts, those health impacts on women and children are some of the most compelling for communities to really understand the implications of these polluting sources on their day-to-day. So, which is not only a result of premature deaths, but also a health cost and implication for those families. Next slide. Fracking fluids in reproductive health are also a dangerous concoction Fracking fluids contain predominantly a mystery concoction of chemicals that, once tested, have been found to have serious endocrine disruptors, cancer, mutations, and other impacts on women's bodies. Next slide. But the oil and gas extractive industry doesn't just pollute women's bodies. There's also a well-documented range of impacts on disappeared women and gender-based violence around the man camps that take place where there are fracking or some of these other extractive industries. So the Sierra Club is working to tell those stories and lift up the voices of the communities, predominantly indigenous communities that are facing those risks. Next slide. Just briefly, this will get touched on later, but the EPA is one of the main agencies that is responsible for reviewing the safety of these chemicals, and right now the cast of characters that is in place to be making those decisions is predominantly from the chemical companies themselves in support of Dow Chemical, Monsanto, and some of the other industry darlings. That impact is seen firsthand with chlorpyrifos, a decision that Administrator Pruitt made earlier this year to not ban a dangerous pesticide, despite overwhelming evidence from EPA scientists themselves saying that it should be removed from use as a result of its dangers on child development and pregnant women. So there's a legal case being led by Earth Justice, the Pesticide Action Network, and NRDC, and we're in support of that. Next slide. This is an infographic telling the similar story about chlorpyrifos. Unsurprisingly, the decision that Pruitt made to continue to keep chlorpyrifos legal and on the shelves came immediately after a meeting with Dow Chemical's CEO. And so just an example of how important our voices are to lend to this fight and make sure that the impacts on people are really heard. Next slide. In terms of personal care products, rather than being regulated by the EPA, they're under the oversight of the FDA, which results in them being largely unregulated. Laws haven't changed since 1938, and personal care products are everything from deodorant to toothpaste to makeup, and women use about 13 products on average, men use about 6 every day. And there's a bill introduced by Senator Feinstein from California that would take a first step in creating some safety regulations, some oversight of the manufacturers, and some disclosures of those personal care products. Fragrances in particular are of grave concern, and predominantly because they're just a concoction of undisclosed chemicals. And so it's always best to stay away from things with fragrances as best we can. I'll note too, it's important to note that women of color and low-income women are disproportionately impacted, both because these products can often be marketed explicitly to women of color, and they, in the case of low-income women, they often show up dollar stores and as a low-income commodity that's available for folks, those that are most toxic. A real challenge there. Next slide. Just quickly, I know I'm already running over my time. There are some resources. Women's Voices for the Earth is doing great work that we partner with. Next. The Environmental Working Group has a Skin Deep website that has analyzed over 72,000 products and is a great resource if you're looking at cosmetics. Next slide. Moms Clean Air Force is over 1 million moms strong and is working to fight some of the air pollutants that I spoke about earlier. Next slide. And just to touch on the fact that this is not just a US challenge, but also impacts women around the world. Water, sanitation, and hygiene results in girls dropping out of school and in women having barriers to enter the workforce. So we're working on that advocacy as well. Next slide. So just to leave you with 2 things to think about before you hear some great on-the-ground stories. Local first, thinking about where chemicals are manufactured, processed, distributed, how is that showing up in your state or your community? And that storytelling is more than just storytelling. It can actually be evidence. And so as some of these hearings show up through the EPA or some of the local hearings where decision making is happening, we don't just need academic research to prove that some toxics are dangerous, but also the stories of people impacted already can be used as evidence and data in some of these fights. So encourage you all to tell your own stories as well. So next slide. And this is a way to get involved with us. Look forward to hearing the other 2 speakers and to answer any questions. Thank you.
Next, we'll have Atiana speak. I'm sorry, Patty from Alaska Community Action on Toxics.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight for this important topic. Next slide. ACAT works at the intersection of the environmental health and justice, social justice, human rights, and reproductive justice movements. Science and the precautionary principle are at the heart of all we do. Basically, that means it's better to be safe than sorry when it comes to chemical safety. Don't use humans as guinea pigs without our consent in a giant uncontrolled experiment on chemical safety. Most people, including Alaskans, think our state is a pristine wilderness unaffected by toxic contamination. Nothing could be further from the truth, however. For reasons I'll explain in just a bit, Alaska and the rest of the circumpolar Arctic are actually more contaminated than lower latitudes, sometimes higher than fence line communities right next to the factory where these chemicals are manufactured. Arctic indigenous people are among the most contaminated people on the planet, principally because their traditional cultures revolve around hunting, fishing, and gathering. Their traditional diet is heavily weighted toward fish and marine mammals, and a contaminated environment means contaminated food sources. The disproportionate exposures and special vulnerability of Alaska Natives makes toxic contamination a matter of ongoing genocide, human rights violations, and environmental violence. As a result, much of our work is done with Alaska Native communities who request our assistance. We try to help everyone who seeks our help, but we focus our policy efforts on protecting vulnerable populations, which is to say, pregnant women, children, and Alaska Natives. Old fishermen say a rising tide floats all boats, which means if we protect the most vulnerable among us, we protect all of us. Our goal of eliminating Alaskans' exposure to toxic chemicals is rather ambitious, and to that end, we collaborate across the state, the nation, and the globe with hundreds of organizations and work with coalitions and networks that share our goal, because we know together we are stronger. Nobody's going to win this battle alone. Next slide. I'm particularly fond of this definition of reproductive, as it clearly shows in the last 2 lines, the connection between environmental justice and reproductive justice, and puts it in a great framework. Toxic chemical isn't just a lethal dose of poison. Sublethal levels can also cause a variety of health problems, including respiratory illness, hormonal disorders, immune system disorders, and for our purpose today, reproductive problems like interfering with the ability to get pregnant, stay pregnant, and deliver a healthy baby, one without birth defects, behavioral and cognitive disorders, and the prenatal origins of adult disease, including cancer and reproductive problems of their own. Timing of exposure matters as well as the dose. The nature of fetal development creates windows of vulnerability, which means that a toxin that affects brain development could have no effect during certain parts of gestation, but devastating effects during the window when the unborn child's brain is undergoing rapid growth. Toxic chemicals that disrupt the endocrine system, which are known as EDCs, are of particular concern for reproductive justice. Next slide. Since NIEHS made this statement 11 years ago, the science demonstrating links between endocrine disrupting chemicals and reproductive health harm is so alarming that previously stayed scientists, content to let their research speak for itself, are now going public and issuing urgent calls to action. To understand why these low levels are so insidious, we need to go back to 7th grade health class for a minute. The endocrine system, which controls our hormones, which give the body its marching orders, operates naturally at very low levels of those hormones on the parts per billion level. When a chemical that mimics natural hormones invades the body at high levels, the body recognizes the invader as such and temporarily shuts down. But when the chemical is present in the body at levels similar to the natural hormones, the body can't tell the difference, so the invader is free to do its damage. This means the old toxicologist bromide, the dose makes the poison, no longer applies. Although our federal chemicals policy, and indeed all our chemical policy at every level, does not address this. Next slide. These are just a few of the chemicals known or suspected of causing reproductive harm. Most, and probably all, of these are endocrine disrupting chemicals. Next slide. I've highlighted in green the conditions linked to reproductive harm. FYI, the reason thyroid conditions are listed there is that when the mother has a thyroid condition, it increases the risk of her having a child with neurodevelopmental impairments, i.e. birth defects. Next slide. Let's turn back to Alaska for a minute and connect the dots. Scientists around the world were shocked when the results of this 1980 study were published. They were so shocked that they banded together to work for a United Nations treaty to address this injustice. The UN Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants went into force in 2004. We found levels of PCBs in Alaska Native people slightly lower than in our Canadian neighbors, only 6 to 9 times higher than the levels in lower 48 populations. The whales, walrus, and seals that form the core of Alaska Native traditional diets have tested at between 100 and almost 600 parts per billion for PCBs. EPA's safe level for unlimited food consumption is 5.9 parts per billion, and EPA advises people not to consume the food at all if it contains more than 100 parts per billion. Next slide. PCBs are not the only reproductive toxin in the Arctic. PBDEs are also problematic, and there are others as well, but I'm going to let these two be representative in terms of the contamination levels and the serious health harms associated with them. Next slide. Perhaps the most shocking thing is that toxic chemicals are being found not just in Arctic adults, but also in newborn babies who are born pre-polluted and in breast milk. Toxins pass through the placenta and breast milk into the baby. The spike in the middle here, second from the left, shows Alaska's level of PBDEs and organochlorine pesticides in breast milk compared to 4 other countries. We're way above, obviously, what's being found in other places. So how did we end up here, you ask? There are 2 primary sources of contamination in Alaska, pollution from military industrial facilities and long-range global transport. Next slide, please. This slide shows some of the 2,000 known hazardous waste sites in Alaska, including abandoned World War II or Cold War military sites, coal and hard rock mines, and oil and gas facilities. Alaska has for a long time had a resource extraction-based economy, which results in a lot of the site-specific contamination. Next slide, please. The other major contributor to Arctic contamination, including Alaska, is long-range global transport of chemicals on wind and ocean currents. This is known as global distillation. The North is a hemispheric sink for pesticides and other industrial chemicals traveling from lower latitudes in the lower 48, which fall out when they hit the cold temperatures here. Northern food webs favor the accumulation of persistent bioaccumulative toxins. Global warming is liberating contaminants that were previously sequestered in now melting permafrost, glaciers, and sea ice, so that's exacerbating the problem. Next slide. Couples who experience these reproductive difficulties you see in this slide almost always blame themselves. Now it's becoming apparent that toxic chemicals are frequently responsible. Alaska Native communities have observed a rise in the incidence of all these health harms over the past few decades. And I would say that the self-blame piece of this shows just how important it is for the medical community to become more knowledgeable about the connection between reproductive difficulties and toxic chemicals so they can help their patients. Next slide, please. Since the dream of all parents to be is to have a healthy baby, the link between chemical contamination and birth defects is a reproductive issue and part of reproductive justice. Next slide, please. There's been an alarming increase in the incidence of irreversible impaired brain development since the end of World War II and the advent of the age of better living through chemistry. Millions of IQ points are lost every year. The science connecting that to these brain-dirtying chemicals is sound and piling up more and more every year. I highly recommend a short film called Little Things Matter by Dr. Bruce Lanphier for more detail. You can find it on YouTube. Next slide, please. The ingredients in common household products frequently include neurotoxic chemicals, and many of them are not disclosed on the labels because of industry claims to trade secrets, much like what you heard about personal care products. Next slide, please. So we need to change our system. We need to change everything about it because individuals can't fix this on their own. We can do some things to make sure our families are less exposed, but we can't eliminate all exposures because we're not chemists and we don't have access to the information. If it wasn't before, protecting public health and the environment has now become a human rights issue. Government must step up to hold polluters accountable. Our current system is not working, and it's not working fast enough. We've got 85,000 chemicals out there since World War II that have been invented and are now dispersed throughout our environment. Only 200 have been tested for safety. The illustration you see on the bottom right is an example of regrettable substitution, which is what happens when one chemical becomes highlighted as toxic. The manufacturers say, well, do we have something that acts like them that isn't that first one? So on the left, you have bisphenol A, which most of us are aware of, is in plastic baby bottles and water bottles. And industry, when the furor arose, they decided to take it out, that they needed to take it out in order to keep selling their products. They substituted BPF and BPS. As you can see, they're chemically, structurally similar and probably have the same negative effects on our health, although we don't know because they haven't been tested. So no one really knows for sure at this point. That means that things like the BPA-free label is not as reassuring as you'd think. And that brings us to the precautionary principle. Next slide. We need a paradigm shift. We need to prioritize protection of public health over industry profits, and we need real prevention, which starts with, it's not limited to, but it starts with testing chemicals for safety before they're manufactured and put on the shelves for sale or used in agriculture, industry, what have you. We also need to ask ourselves whether we really need all these chemicals. Maybe the vinegar and baking soda our grandmothers used for household cleaning is good enough. Maybe we need to accept a certain amount of crop loss without pesticides, and that would mean higher food prices, among other things, instead of ever more deadly pesticides. Maybe we don't need synthetic fragrances with phthalates in every lotion, potion, detergent, and air freshener. And we need to start thinking about the reality that we're exposed to more than one chemical at a time. So how do those mixtures affect our health, and how do we regulate that? We need to think about regulating classes of chemicals to avoid the problem of regrettable substitutions. And there was a good step made in that regard just recently with the Consumer Product Safety Board, thanks to our good friends at the Green Science Policy Institute. And we need to support green chemistry, which is to say the engineering of chemicals for safety as part of their design before they're ever manufactured. So that's an outline of the problem and what we're up against. What can we do? Next slide, please. So there's a whole lot of things we can do here. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. The government will not protect us unless we speak out and insist they do. Right now, the chemical industry is speaking more loudly than we are, but we have one power: they do not vote. We have the power to vote, each one of us. Let's use it. So next slide, please. First up is to learn and then teach. I've got a number of places here, some have been mentioned before, where you can learn a lot. They do their best not to be wonky and not to be too sciencey. They talk in plain language. The first one I'd highly recommend, this is a program of Alaska Community Action on Toxics. These are monthly seminars where we bring you cutting-edge science about the latest research on the links between toxic chemicals and health harms. I would also say that as a book lover, I'd like to recommend Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, the book that started it all, and another personal favorite, Theo Colburn's Our Stolen Future, which was the beginning of our understanding of endocrine disrupting chemicals. You should also look at the Green Science Policy Institute, which is greensciencepolicy.org. Your local librarian can help you find more stuff. Okay, next slide. All right, so one of the things you can do is join a local grassroots organization that works for environmental reproductive justice and get involved in the activities they have. This is pictures from our Power to the People workshops to empower women by offering training in civic engagement, getting registered to vote, voting, how to testify, how to participate in the public process, how to organize your community, and run successful market or legislative campaigns. I'll betcha there's something like this in your community if you look. Next slide. Market shifts. Retailers don't want unsold merchandise taking up shelf space. That's the essence of market campaigns. This is sometimes called voting with your pocketbook. So look at your personal buying habits, look at what you're buying and what's in it and what you might be buying instead. Skin Deep, as was mentioned before, the database of personal care and cleaning products is quite helpful in that regard. You can use it right there in the grocery store aisle. You don't have to learn in advance, you just pick up the product and scan it and it'll tell you what's in it. The great thing about market campaigns is that they can often succeed much more quickly than a legislative or regulatory campaign, and BPA is a perfect example of that. California moms would not buy baby bottles with BPA in it. It vanished. The same thing with formaldehyde in Johnson & Johnson baby shampoo. It vanished. When moms got upset and stopped buying, they changed. But you can also look further to other places, your local school district, municipal government procurement policies, what's being bought and used in your own workplace. If you want, you can check out Safer Chemicals Healthy Families. They have a nationwide campaign called Mind the Store. Just go to their website and click in. You'll get the emails about what to do and when. Next step. Slide, not step. Local legislation is a great place to start. They're sometimes the easiest place to go and to do because they're easy to understand and you don't have to influence as many people. These are lists of the kinds of things that ACAT has been working on in the last year or so. Each one of these is one that we've already won. There's others that are still not yet adopted, but I thought I'd show you some of the kinds of things we work on. The point here is to find something that is important to your local community and work on that. I mean, if you're not an agricultural community, you probably don't care so much about the sewage sludge on agricultural land. So find something that means something to you and work on that. Next slide. State legislation has two benefits. First, obviously, they protect the state's residents from exposure to toxics, but they also create momentum for comprehensive federal reform to avoid a patchwork of different state schemes with multinational and cross-boundary in-state corporations. They sell across the whole country. They don't want to have different rules applying. So that's a great way to get a federal law. Anyway, we're working in Alaska as part of a nationwide strategy of the Safer States Coalition on getting flame retardants out of children's products. This might make sense for your state, or there might be something else that makes more sense. You and the grassroots groups in your community can figure that out. Next. Joining an advocacy organization lets you be part of the effort to fix our federal system. You'll get action alerts to let you know about opportunities to contact your congressional delegation, add your voice to the national debate. Because really, I mean, ACAT can go, here we are, but there's also a whole bunch of voters in here. And the voters are what matters, not my organization or the organization you might belong to, but the people who vote, because they have the power to reelect or not reelect the people who are in office. And that's the most important thing to them. So working together, voter voices have the power to drown out the messages lobbyists are whispering into our elected officials' ears because they can't vote and we can. So get engaged, visit their offices, call them, send them letters, send them emails, and don't stop. It's fun, it doesn't take a lot of time, and it is incredibly effective. It's really amazing, especially if you live in a low population state like Alaska. All right, next slide. I'm almost done. So why should we care about what's going on at the international level, and why should we spend our time there? Well, for Alaska, it's because chemicals don't respect political boundaries, and that long-range global transport that I talked about disproportionately affects us. It doesn't mean it doesn't affect you guys in the lower 48. It's just more critical for us, but it is important to you as well. What happens in China doesn't stay in China. It comes right across the Pacific Ocean and straight into the U.S. Airstreams. So Over time, we've gotten 4 international treaties under the helm of the United Nations that deal specifically with toxic ingredients or toxic chemicals in our environment and in the stuff we use. And it's been really helpful because they specifically address the fact that the Arctic is disproportionately affected and especially vulnerable. So next slide. Since 2004, using science and a flair for the dramatic, ACAT and its allies have been instrumental in achieving global bans of more than 24 of the world's source chemicals, all of which are found in the Arctic, its wildlife, and its people. We remind the treaty nations of their obligation to address these disproportionate exposures and special vulnerability by bringing a delegation of Arctic Indigenous women to their meetings and having the women address the plenary session and indulge in a little street theater out in the lobby. It is a lot of work, but it's sometimes easier to get things done internationally than in Washington, D.C., especially since you can get all the nation's countries to take action at once. You don't have to go country by country. You can do it all at once. There's a lot at stake. There's no time to lose, not with 85,000 chemicals out there. We need all the help we can get, those of us who are working on reproductive justice. So fortunately, you too, whoever you are, wherever you are, however much you know or don't know, and however little time or a lot of time you have, all of you can be champions for environmental reproductive justice. Future generations will thank you, as do I. Next slide. That's it for me.
Thank you, Patty. Next, we'll have Shannon Abbott from the Grand Rapids Water Protectors.
Hi, everyone. How are you tonight? I hope that you've been enjoying everything so far. I wanted to talk to you a little bit from the standpoint of a water protector. My name is Shannon Abbott. I'm with the Grand Rapids Water Protectors. I'm also on the board of 3 additional water-based environmental nonprofit organizations as well. You've heard a lot about some of the different things that are poisoning people right now and are really affecting the reproductive justice that we have in our society through a lot of the health issues that are going on right now. But we have both indirect and direct issues that we're dealing with. We are basically in a spider web where all of the issues that we're facing right now with society, they're all interconnected, especially when we're looking at correlations with the environment and reproductive justice. We've got our politics and our policies. We've got racism, classism, personal financial stability, health, economy, civil rights, which all somehow connect together and oftentimes affect each other in a very direct way, but sometimes long-term in an indirect way as well. Looking at something like this here is based mostly in water. This image really shows how the things that we're doing in our cultures and in our societies, not just in the United States, but across the world, they are affecting our land, air, and water right now. And some of the impacts that we have coming onto that, we've got pollution in our waterways where we can't fish. A lot of the fish are dying. We're actually getting more pollution from plastics and things that people have thrown away and things like that inside of our waterways. We've got actual chemicals and oils, and there was just an article out a couple of days ago about a fishery that's been dumping fish blood back into the water systems and is killing off other life within our water systems and ultimately affecting our health when it comes down to us drinking it, because our land is what grows our food. It's what feeds our food. Our air is what we breathe in every day, and our water is what all life needs to sustain. It's what feeds our land and our air both. We impact, or we take in all of these things every single day. We interact with them every single day, but they're kind of out of sight, out of mind for us for some reason, and they shouldn't be. They're very, very important issues. They're very important resources that we've highly taken advantage of for a very long time. They all come back again to short-term versus long-term in those same topics that I just mentioned. We have to think about how anything that we're dealing with as far as an issue right now, how it relates both short-term and long-term in our politics and our policies, and how our past has been racist, how we are as a society pretty racist right now, and how is that going to affect racism in the future? Same thing with classism, our personal financial stability, health, economy, and civil rights overall. Right now with the Grand Rapids Water Protectors, we are dealing with quite a few issues. Line 5 is a huge one in Grand Rapids locally. What's in your water? EWG.org has posted, you put in your zip code and it tells you what toxins are found in your water systems. All of those shown in the center here in yellow are all cancer-causing toxins that are below federal guidelines, but they're above health guidelines for where we should be at. That's something that I drink every single day. And those are often things that I can't get out of my water with filters and things like that. So unless I'm buying bottled water, going to Nestle, for instance, who is plundering water from left and right and about an hour from here, then I'm drinking in a lot of these toxins that you see. Places like Flint right now, everybody knows about some of the issues that have happened in Flint, Michigan, but it's not the only issue that we have in Michigan. Besides some of our poisoned waterways, our pipelines, we've got affordability issues for water as well. We've got fracking becoming a major issue, which also brings in a lot of racial justice issues, as it has in other states as well.
Shannon, this is Yumhi. Quickly,
Yeah.
I just want to double check that we're on the correct slide.
Short-term versus long-term with the shutdown line 5.
Nope.
Got it. Okay.
Are you on it?
Yep. And if you could just say
Okay.
next slide, that would be great. Thanks.
Oh, did you take over?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Fair enough. Next slide then. Next slide. Oh, hold on a second. Sorry, guys, it's showing differently for me than it is for you. So this right here, what you're looking at, this is relating back to Flint because this is one of the national issues that a lot of people are very well aware of right now. We're looking at a chart on the left here. This is actually from the Washington Post. That was an article just a couple of months ago here. And what this is showing is everywhere else is the top line as far as fetal death rates. And then the bottom line, you can see that huge dip down on the bottom there. That's actually in Flint, right around the time before people knew that there was lead in the water, when lead actually became contaminated in the water sources. When the lead water crisis first happened in Flint, Michigan, a lot of people were complaining about different health issues. People were complaining about miscarriages and all sorts of things that were happening, pets dying, all sorts of other issues, but they weren't taken seriously. Almost 4 years after the lead water crisis actually happened and has become exposed, they are now starting to talk about what actually was impacted and the fact that children did die because of this. Adults died because of this. Unborn children died because of this water crisis. And it was because of the negligence and some of the policies involved in the area, but also an aging infrastructure that was never taken care of properly. something that was underneath our feet the whole time that we never thought to actually take care of. We never knew it would be an issue, but it's also in one of the poorest areas in our nation as well. And that's a huge portion of what keeps happening as well, because next slide. Because not only are we dealing with issues like that in Flint, thousands of cities across the nation are showing lead higher than Flint. Over 3,000 areas in our nation have levels that are far exceeding what Flint has ever been. And it's not just lead either. It's other toxic chemicals that we've already been talking about. High levels and unsafe levels found in over 33 states. And this was actually at the end of last year that this particular article in the center came out. It's an outrageous amount. This affects every single person in our nation, and we keep hearing more and more stories about why these are issues. 71 places in Michigan alone have higher lead levels than in Flint. And you can see the quote here, that it's likely to take years to remedy anything that happens. It takes millions of dollars, and it takes years and years before anything is affected. But you also have to worry about, again, the long-term repercussions with these issues. We have healthcare that is majorly impacted. In Flint, again, we've had stories about the hospitals in the area that were actually tainted with poisoned water, treating patients that came in because of lead poisoning. And they didn't know that their waterways were poisoned either. They were told that they were at safe levels, but they weren't. Next slide. So things like miscarriages, sterilization, illness, death, those rates are rising, and they are going to continue to rise as we see it right now. So it's important to talk about the issues now, but we have to consider, again, the long-term impact of any of the attacks on our bodies and of the things on our environment as well. In the Grand Rapids area, Kent County just released a study approximately a month ago that showed that over 600 children last year went in because of lead poisoning, not in their water system, but because of lead in the paint in their homes due to construction. Again, with our aging infrastructure, we have tons of homes that are older than 1978 here that do have lead paint in them. And the policies are not in place, or they're not being adhered to properly to actually make sure that the proper protocols are followed to make sure that people aren't getting sick. Not just adults, but again, children and the elderly are extremely susceptible to these things. Pesticides is another issue that we deal with. We're an agricultural state. We have a ton of farms everywhere, runoff from chemicals in our farmlands, as well as the sewage that we get from some of the animal agriculture farmlands have been continuous issues. They all seep back into our land, back into our food, back into our water, and into our body. Next slide. So why do we activate? And by activate, I mean basically getting involved. Everybody has a different reason, and it's important for everybody to find their own reason. Find your reason, find your purpose. For me, as an example, I grew up in East Lansing, Michigan, the home of MSU, Michigan State University, which is also an agricultural campus. And I was very fortunate that my mom was a teacher, or was going to school to be a teacher when I was a child. So we actually got to grow up in student housing on campus. I grew up in an elementary school with over 50 different nationalities. I was surrounded by diversity, and I was surrounded by really positive influences everywhere. My perception growing up was like a utopia compared to as I got older and I got outside of that area. When I left, I was absolutely shocked at knowing how different the rest of the world is and was. How everybody is treated differently, and how our environment and our people are taken advantage of on a daily basis. I thought that the destruction of our earth and the divisions of our people were really far in view and reserved for big cities and poor countries, but it was right in my backyard the whole time. I wouldn't change any of my experience for the world because I've seen how it can be, but I see now my reasons and my purposes for being involved. Because like in the bottom corner here, that little baby, that little bug, she almost didn't make it into this world. That's my little niece right there, Sadie. She almost didn't make it into this world. And she's been battling health issues ever since she was born. She's a year and a half old now. Because our world as a whole is being destroyed. Reproduction does us no good if there isn't a world to live on. And because our animals, our plants, and more are being affected, they're also unable to reproduce in a healthy and safe way. And because, like my friends on the left side here, this is actually a picture from my high school prom. Half of these beautiful women in this photo actually lost one or more of their parents before we even left high school. That's a burden that they and their families will have to live with forever. And they were all from dying from things like cancer, as an example. And as we learn more about some of those health issues, some of the things that their parents died from, we know that it comes from environmental issues. So it's not just little ones coming into the world or potentially not quite making it, but it's also for those women on the left-hand side again who had to grow up without their parents, who had to grow up without their mothers. Next slide. So where Grand Rapids Water Protectors comes in is basically in uniting and trying to bring a lot of the issues together, because we do need everyone. These issues affect everyone, and we need to reach them, and we need to show them how by relating it back to the individual and not necessarily back to ourselves. Next slide. So marching, rallies, protests, camps, they're not the only ways to help, but those are the ones that you see the most of. There are so many other important ways of helping. A lot of you are in the field of law, and law support is very much needed in these issues. It's needed in the political realm especially, but it's also needed for the people in those camps and at those marches and protests, because everybody needs support to make sure that our voices are being heard. We need researchers. We need people who can do press and PR, media, artists, and many, many areas more, because there's a place for everyone since everybody is affected in some way. Next slide. More than anything, we need people to show up, and we need their voices to be heard. You see some pictures in here from some of our human rights rallies, from the Women's March right after the inauguration, from Standing Rock, from Flint, from right underneath the Mackinac Bridge in the Straits of Mackinac, where 90% of the nation's fresh water is, or 95%, I'm sorry, is actually at risk from being polluted, affecting over potentially 30 million people when that pipeline breaks. So it's important to keep talking and to keep showing up, to keep calling, to keep sending letters, and to keep getting involved in the areas where you feel most comfortable, but to also continue the education and branch out into other areas. Next slide. One of my favorite quotes here. Solidarity is based on the principle that we are willing to put ourselves at risk to protect each other. Starhawk. And that's very true, because we all have different reasons for being involved, but we are all affected, and none of us can survive. Our country can't survive. Our world can't survive if we don't band together and put our comfort at risk to be able to move forward as a society. But what's really important on top of this is, especially in the water-based issues realm, and this is across the board, but the inequality gaps that we have, the racism gaps that we have, it affects how each of us get involved. With Flint as an example, I was nervous about getting involved in the Flint water crisis and trying to give my aid into that community, and so were some of the other people in our group. And the reason is because we're not from that community, and because it is a predominantly minority community, predominantly Black community. And I personally, I'm a cisgender white woman that lives in a wealthy city. But it doesn't mean that I care any less. The important thing that I needed to remember is that I need to respect the community, as does everybody. Respect the communities that are directly involved. Removing the fear from ourselves and removing our own egos is a big thing, because it's not about any one of us, it's about everybody. When it comes down to it, your intention, perception, and the reality, they're all different things, but they're all equally important if we're going to move forward together. We have to understand how other people perceive what we're doing, if whether or not our intention is good, and if the reality of what we're doing and what we wanted to accomplish is actually happening. We need to check in consistently with our communities and with all of the people involved in these issues, because there are so many groups right now that are getting involved, and that's fantastic. But if we keep ourselves separated, we can't move forward quite as easily. We keep reinventing the wheel. So checking in with each other, checking in with our community. To speak and connect with national teams like we're doing right now, and to have those conversations on a normal basis. To get involved with local organizations as well as larger organizations that are already there and already doing work, like with the Detroit water affordability crisis, where children right now, both in Detroit and in Flint, the water bills are so high that most people are fighting water shutoff. Families people that have children in those areas are continuously threatened that their children will be taken away from them because they can't provide an adequate living condition for their families. But it's because they have some of the highest water bills in the nation, and they are 2 to 5 times higher than what other places pay, making it completely unreasonable and unrealistic for people to be able to pay those bills. Can be hard and daunting to become involved in such a broad topic like the environment or like reproductive justice, but we don't really have a choice right now. And it is even harder to work with communities that we're not used to working with or that we're not necessarily a part of right now. But again, we don't have a choice. The savior complex is a really big fear. That people are just going to come in for their own selfish purposes, bringing their ego in to come in and save these poor little communities that can't do better for themselves. But again, if we remove that ego and we allow the voices of the community to be heard first, then we can definitely get around that by educating ourselves first and then others after that. Is one of the ways that we can do that. So it's easy to focus on what we think, why we think that people should be involved, but we also have to remember that our reasons are not necessarily their reasons. So talking to people and really finding why these issues pertain to them individually is a huge step in the right direction, and it brings up more issues than you could have ever thought of. Talking about water and why water affects so many different people is what brought me into reproductive justice in the first place, and what brought me into talking to a little girl, a little 3-year-old girl at Camp Promise of Flint, when that was still open. And she was a local in the community, and I said, do you know why we're here right now? And it broke my heart knowing that she said, it's because I'm sick, because my water has poisoned me, and because I might die. So talking and getting involved in the areas that really relate to you can take you in a direction that you never would have thought of. So don't be afraid to continue with that. And I'm going to actually leave it at that because I know we're already over time here. And I'm going to give it back to you.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks to all our speakers. I think this has been a really wonderful presentation. I know I learned a lot of things I didn't know. If you are in the audience, and we're going to try to keep this short since I know we're running low on time. If you have, as you've been listening, you've been feeling like you want to take action right now, one of the things you can do, as Atiana had talked about, we know that the nominees to the EPA are people who have spent their careers trying to support the chemical industry. And so, for example, Michael Dorson, President Trump's nominee to oversee the chemical safety at the Environmental Protection Agency, has been paid by polluters like Monsanto, Dow, DuPont to weaken chemical safety standards. In fact, he founded and ran a science for hire consulting firm called Toxicology Excellence for Risk Assessment, that was paid for by chemical companies. And really the goal of it was to greenwash safety assessments of these chemicals. And he has been nominated to oversee chemical safety. So one quick action that you can all take if you are concerned about nominees like this is to call your senators and let them know that you are committed, and you think the people in the EPA should be committed to protecting the environment and regulating the very chemicals and things that they are charged with overseeing. And I know we are out of time, but I did want to ask one question to our speakers, and that's kind of given all the presentations and what has happened, what we've heard today, what is the one thing that you would like to see the people on this webinar do? What's the one action that you think could be most impactful? Shannon, go ahead. Patty, do you want to speak?
Sure, I was waiting for whoever else had started, but I think probably the smartest, best thing you can do is not try to do it by yourself. Find a group of people who think like you do and care about what you care about, and be with them, because it can be a really, really lonely place to try to do it by yourself. And you'll be more effective if you do it in a group, and happier. So that's what I would say.
Okay, and Shannon, did you have one thing that you think rises to the top of actions people could do?
Oh, that's such a tough one. I guess the first thing that I would do is I would go to ewg.org and I would figure out what is in your water right now, because you are drinking in those chemicals every single day. And I think it's important for everybody to know that, because it does affect our family's health and our reproductive health on a normal basis. And hopefully it'll guide you into some of the other water issues that are out there as well right now, like Line 5, that's going to affect our entire nation.
All right, great. Thank you so much for presenting on this webinar. This is really great information, and thank you to all the people who participated and listened. We really appreciate you taking the time and staying with us till the end. Yamhi, were there any other housekeeping remarks?
No, just that this webinar is being recorded, and we will send out the recording in the next couple of days. And thank you to everyone for attending and all the speakers.
Thank you all for organizing it.
Yeah, and now we'll close. Thank you, everyone.